Senator Chandler, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. You have always been such a staunch advocate for single-sex spaces in women's and girls' sport in particular. Can you tell me what motivated you, what really drove you and inspired you to take that position in the first instance?
Well, Lucy, back in 2019, the Australian Human Rights Commission consulted with Sport Australia, and these two bodies came up with a set of guidelines around inclusion in sport. And those guidelines said that a person's inclusion in sport should be on the basis of their gender identity rather than their biological sex. And when you have peak sporting bodies in this country saying something like that, it's only understandable that women and girls in particular, and mums and dads with daughters playing sport, are concerned about what that means for women's sport longer term. So not long after those guidelines were published, I started receiving email after email after email from mums and dads in particular around the country, and also women who are competing in sport, whether it's at the elite level or down at the grassroots level, concerned about the erosion of women's sport as a result of these guidelines. And so from there, I started doing what any good politician should be doing, and asking questions of the Australian Human Rights Commission and asking questions of Sport Australia. You know, how did you come up with these guidelines? Did you consult with women in sport? They didn't, which I think is one of the reasons that we are in the situation that we're currently in. But this is a massive issue, and I've always thought that the overwhelming majority of Australians want to see women and girls sports protected, want to ensure that women and girls can continue to participate in sport on a fair and level and safe playing field. But unfortunately, if you permit people of the opposite biological sex, if you allow biological males into women's sport, then that fairness and that safety is not going to be guaranteed. And the really sad thing is that since our own national sporting body came up with these guidelines back in 2019, we've had example upon example upon example of international sporting bodies developing guidelines that say that, yes, sport should be separated on the basis of sex. You've had World Rugby do the studies that say that there is an 80% increased risk of head injury if a woman is tackled by a biological male, I should say, on the playing field. You've got World Aquatics surveying all of its athletes, and these athletes are saying that overwhelmingly, again, more than 80% think that sport should be separated on the basis of sex. So I think that Australian sporting bodies are wildly out of step with what has been happening internationally in this space over the last 4 or so years, and they're also completely out of step with the views of everyday Australians that just want women and girls to be able to compete on a fair and even and safe playing field.
We just saw also the news this week that World Netball made the announcement and produced their policy on inclusion and participation, which of course speaks to what you're saying and supports the belief that sport should be reserved in the international netball space for biological women, with some exceptions. And you posted a really interesting comment about it on X, where you said basically, Netball Australia, what's your excuse? Which speaks to the point that you're making about why we're seeing these overarching international governing bodies make these big decisions, but we're really lagging when it comes to our domestic policies. Why is that?
Well, I think there are a few reasons why our national sporting bodies in Australia are lagging behind. And part of it is that I do think the CEOs of these bodies and the boards of these bodies are pushing this very elitist view that inclusion in sport is more important than fairness and safety. And I think that that's a really sad reflection on them. But the reality is we are also in a situation in this country where there is a lack of clarity in law as to whether sport can be offered on a single-sex basis to ensure that women and girls sport is preserved. And this was what the guidelines that were developed by Sport Australia went to, again, with legal advice from the Australian Human Rights Commission. So we have this very confusing situation where we have a piece of legislation, the Sex Discrimination Act, that was designed, amongst other things, to ensure that women and girls sport could be preserved for people of the biological female sex. That's what the original sporting exemption in that act said. Now, back in 2013, that act was changed to insert gender identity as a protected attribute into the legislation as well. And that's where all of this confusion comes from. And if you think that this isn't happening in real life, that this is some very technical legal argument that doesn't have real world ramifications, I mean, point one, you've got what's happening on sporting fields across this country, but point two, you have the very current example of a woman called Sal Grover, who has had to take her case to the federal court to figure out whether she has a legal right to be able to operate a social media app purely for females. And I think it's completely unreasonable that women in this country are going through the court system to find out if they have those legal rights. Just the same, I've spoken to sporting administrators at a very community local level, and they likewise are completely unsure about whether they have the legal right to offer single-sex sport for women and girls. So clearly some clarification is needed in law to remove all of the legal risk from these very scenarios that I've just described. And that's why I introduced the Save Women's Sports Bill back in 2022 to clarify at law that no sporting body or no sporting administrator could have legal action taken against them simply for offering single-sex sport for women and girls.
I'd love you to elaborate on the Save Women's Sports Bill, which, as you said, you introduced in 2022. I personally feel that it didn't meet the fate that it deserved, particularly when we consider now not just the safety and protection of women and girls in these active sports spaces, but also beyond that, to your point about Sal Grover, who, of course, I've made no secret of supporting very publicly in all of this. And I know that a lot of Australians and international women and men also feel the same about it. But I want to talk more around the context of the Save Women's Sports Bill, the purpose of it, and why it didn't actually get up, and the challenges that you faced with trying to introduce it into Parliament.
Sure. So back towards the end of 2021 and the start of 2022, having realised that there was this lack of legal clarity around this issue, as somebody who'd been very involved in this debate and consulted very widely with women and girls in particular, and some people involved in the sporting world, particularly professional athletes at all sorts of levels, I took it upon myself to develop the legislation that would clarify this issue. And so I introduced a private senator's bill into the Senate in February 2022, the Save Women's Sports Bill, which sought to clarify that no sporting administrator could have legal action taken against them if they operated single-sex sport for women and girls. Obviously, not long after that, we had a federal election and a new government was elected. And one of the greatest disappointments I had of that government at the time was not long after then, both the Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, and the Sport Minister, Annika Wells, said that there was no need for my Save Women's Sports Bill, that sports were looking after this issue themselves. And indeed, many of the CEOs of sporting organisations, peak sporting bodies in this country, came out and said exactly the same thing at that time. Now, 2 years down the track, we have Football New South Wales publicly requesting from that same sports minister, Annika Wells, that clarification is needed in discrimination law to determine whether or not they can offer single-sex sport for women and girls. So it's a bit of a turnaround from the sporting administrators, from previously saying there was no need for my bill. And again, I think that goes to some of the ideological capture of CEOs and boards of sporting organisations around the country, to suddenly realising that this is absolutely a real issue. We have a clear-cut example in New South Wales of a team that has biological males on it absolutely walloping a female-only team in the final, and people are saying this isn't fair, this isn't reasonable. Sporting organisations, please clarify this issue for us. And those organisations are now saying, oh, hang on, the law's not right. So it's a very interesting situation to be in. But again, if my bill were law today, I don't think that we'd have these issues.
So I want to elaborate on all of that, because a large part of why I got involved in this debate was not only because I've personally felt these feelings for as long as this is presented as an issue in sport and society, but because it started to entrench into my turf, right, of football. And I started engaging with you, and had seen via X that you had noticed the story that had emerged, that 24 women at the community level have basically abandoned the game of football because they don't want to compete against a team with 5 transgender women in it called the Flying Bats. Now, I support the inclusion of everybody, and I think it goes without saying that we extend a lot of sympathy to the transgender community and those who are suffering serious and very, difficult challenges and issues when it comes to gender dysphoria and finding their place in society. But what you said earlier I thought was fantastic, because I think we've reached a point where we are prioritising inclusion over fairness. And I can't claim that quote. That comes from Riley Gaines herself, who we know internationally is also dealing with her own problems within swimming and her own challenges with respect to the participation of transgender athletes. But you said something that caught my eye, and you mentioned that because you said in 2022, the talking points used against my bill were that government should stay out of it because sports have it under control. In 2024, this story proves that that's clearly not the case. I'm just wondering, is this a situation, Senator, if I can speak so frankly, where everyone is just terrified to have any kind of a position on the matter, and they are just passing the buck? Because when I contacted Football Australia for comment regarding that story, they said, we're not in a position to comment on this and we are waiting on the government's advice, which is imminent. I just can't help but feel like everyone is too scared to come out and to have a strong policy on this in sport, which I believe is a massively missed opportunity for football being a global sport and the leader at the grassroots level in this country in terms of participation. But why are people so afraid, particularly our politicians, who we want to be able to reflect the views of the majority and the people and ensure that everyone's voices matter in this? Why are they so afraid?
Oh, look, I think that's the million-dollar question, really, Lucy. And you say that sports politicians have been buck passing on this issue. I would say there's been a lack of leadership on this issue, and I think that's particularly why women and girls that are involved in sport in this country feel like they have been really let down. But it has been a tough issue to talk about historically, and I first started talking about these issues, defending the sex-based rights of women and girls towards the end of 2019, towards the start of 2020, and I copped some really bad abuse, particularly on social media, and straight to my senatorial email address about my advocacy. I was taken to the local Anti-Discrimination Commission here in Tasmania to seek re-education because an individual thought that my views were so bigoted and horrible. And it is really tough when there is a very vocal minority of people out there who are happy to abuse and denigrate women in particular who speak out about this. I can understand why some women are scared, or previously have been scared to speak out. And one of the advantages that I had when I was going through this process a few years ago of dealing with this abuse and dealing with the quasi-judicial processes that I had to go through was that I was a senator for Tasmania. I was able to go into our nation's parliament and talk about these issues. I was able to talk to some elements of the media that were happy to report on these issues and use my platform to progress the cause. Normal, everyday women and girls on the street don't have that same ability. They don't have the ability to publicly defend themselves. And whether it's copping abuse on social media, whether it's being threatened with your employment, whether it's feeling that you can, you might lose friends out of your advocacy on these issues. Certainly, I mean, I found myself in that situation where I've lost friendships over my advocacy, which is disappointing, but I guess it's the reality that we're living in. But I do think that this tide is starting to turn, and when I think about those sort of turning points over the last few years, I do go back to the middle of 2022 when World Aquatics came up with their policy to specify that swimming would be segregated on the basis of sex. And we had some of our incredible swimming champions like Kate Campbell and Emma McEwen and Emily Seebohm publicly speaking out about these issues. I think to have those household names and athletes that were either still competing or had only recently sort of moved off into other areas of their life and publicly talking about these issues, that really did, I think, embolden more Australians to start thinking about these issues more seriously. And again, the example that we've seen in New South Wales recently is such a clear-cut example of how unfair it is when you allow biological males into women's sports. So all of these examples that keep cropping up, I think, are starting to turn the tide on the issue. And embolden people to start talking about these issues publicly. I mean, I've always been absolutely convinced that the overwhelming majority of Australians were with me on these issues, but like you say, in recent years it has been difficult to talk about these issues publicly, and you sort of have to wait to an extent for the tide to start to turn for more people to start raising these issues. But yeah, I think we're starting to see some progress now. Sadly not at the leadership level of sport in this country, but certainly at the grassroots level.
So what avenues, Senator, do we or can we provide for these people who are terrified to speak out, but to who ultimately also share the same views that we do in our position on this? What can we do? I mean, is it as simple as just reigniting and generating attention around the Save Women's Sports Bill? What can we do to let these people's voices and allow them to be heard?
Well, first of all, my door is always open, and I'm always more than willing to have conversations with women and girls, whether you're at the grassroots level of sport, whether you're a professional athlete, and I've spoken to both of those sorts of people and everyone in between over the last few years about these issues. I'm more than happy to talk to those women and girls and advocate on their behalf. But one of the other things I found, again, over the last few years is it's important to build networks of people who you know are very supportive of the positions that you've taken. And, you know, I've used the example of my friend Sal Grover, who's currently going through the federal court with a very similar fight on her hands over the provisions in the Sex Discrimination Act. Catherine Dees from Save Women's Sport Australia. There have been countless examples. Rachel Wong from Women's Forum Australia. Lots of examples of women around this country who are starting to speak out on these issues and providing all of them with the support to be able to keep fighting for these issues. And yourself, Lucy, it is so wonderful to have somebody in the media, particularly a woman with your background in sports, willing to report on these issues now, because one of the frustrations I find when I'm talking to people about these issues is, you know, they're saying we're raising it with our local newspaper, we want to get something written, you know, in our local rag, and no one wants to cover these issues. So it's good that the media is really starting to turn their attention to these concerns as well.
Final question for you, Claire, and it's one that I'm asking everybody that I've chosen to conduct interviews with over the next weeks, months, years, however long it takes for us to be able to advance this cause and to see some resolution and some solutions and the protection of women and girls in sport and beyond. What does the future of women's and girls' sport, biological women and girls' sport, look like if we don't enact change in this space?
I think, sadly, if we don't enact change in this space, we will stop seeing women on podiums at elite competition level, whether that's the Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games, whatever competition it is, because we know that if you allow biological males into those categories, it's not fair. They will start winning in those categories because they are stronger, their muscle mass is different to women's, their bone density is different, all of these things. That's at the elite level. You are also going to see males taking the spots of females on teams, and that's not fair. I know many women that have competed and trained for many, many years to be able to get to not even the highest level in their sport, just a level of sport that they feel some sense of personal achievement over. And if all of a sudden you say that women aren't able to do that because they have to give up their spot for a biological male, well, that's not fair either. You're also going to see a massive increase of injury on the playing field in contact sport, whatever that might be. And we sort of haven't got into this today, but it's always one of the greatest puzzlements I have that sporting administrators in contact sports haven't taken this issue seriously when there is a massive injury risk to their own athletes. And I can only imagine what their insurance premiums are going to look like going forward if they're allowing biological males onto the football field or onto the rugby field to, you know, wallop females who are playing in those same sporting codes. But one of the most heartbreaking things, and this is, again, going back to when I was first getting emails about these issues back in 2019, 2020, this always broke my heart, that young women and girls in particular would be deterred from competing in the sport of their choice at whatever level that was because they didn't want to be competing against biological males, whether they felt unsafe doing that or whether they felt it simply wasn't fair. We have spent too much time and too much energy and too much money in this country supporting women's sporting organisations and supporting women to compete at the very highest levels that they can and to get involved in sport in whatever way they can, to all of a sudden have this massive deterrent factor of saying, well, sorry girls, sorry sportswomen, you're now going to have to make way on the playing field, on the track, in the pool, wherever that might be, for a biological male to enter your competition. So that deterrence factor really concerns me as well. And like I say, I just think we've all worked too hard to get women's sport to where it currently is, to suddenly say, well, women's sport isn't actually for women anymore.
Very well said, Senator. I cannot thank you for your voice, for your advocacy in this space. It is such a relief and really powerful to see a woman like yourself, you know, within the political system that is taking on this fight. We are and will always be eternally grateful to you. Thank you for your time. Before I let you go, one last thing. Where can people go to show their support for the Save Women's Sports Bill?
My Save Women's Sports Bill is all still publicly available on the Australian Parliament website, so you can go and read about it there and read the speech that I tabled and the explanatory memorandum and all of the information about it there. But also head along to my website, senatorchandler.com.au, and all of the information is there, and you can show your support on my website as well.